I almost died from eating Hotpot and had to spend an entire day in the emergency room. This was easily the worst food poisoning experience I have ever had. And you're probably wondering how I managed to get food poisoning from a dish that is literally a huge pot of boiling water, which is a good question. And so before I get into this crazy ass story alongside warning you what not to do, I just want to quickly say that this is episode 3 of my Storytime videos, and so please feel free to also check out any other stories if you have missed them. And no, I didn't plan on making 2 food poisoning stories in a row, it just turned out that way. And with that being said, I of course need to set the scene. All of this started on day 1 of my month of traveling near the end of 2025. The plan was to land at the Taoyuan airport in Taipei and take a taxi to the Danshui area, which is also near where my grandparents lived and where my mom was staying at the time to take care of them. I show up to the apartment my mom was staying at and drop off my luggage while we waited for our family friend to show up, who was also a local in the area. My mother tells me that she plans on taking us to a spicy hotpot restaurant, which was a short walk away, as my entire family loves spicy food, except for my dad. The 3 of us get to this restaurant, which was called Zhujian Happy Hotpot. Now, before I say anything else, how I got food poisoning is entirely my fault. This hotpot place is extremely good, the staff was very kind, and there was a huge selection of nice food and drinks, etc, etc. Please do not go review bombing this place. In fact, if you are in the area, I suggest you check it out yourself, as long as you don't do what I did. I've also had hotpot like 1,000 times, and this was the only time I've ever gotten food poisoning from it, because I'm a dumbass. So don't let this video scare you away from eating hotpot. It is around 4 p.m. as we get seated, we grab our sauces and side dishes, blah blah blah, and as the waitress is passing out the meat dishes, one of the meat dishes we ordered, she tells us that the meat is very tender and should not be overcooked, and that we should essentially swirl it around in the boiling water to cook it instead of like tossing it in there and having the meat be potentially overcooked and become like eating a leather belt. Okay, that was not the exact translation of what she said in Chinese, but that is essentially what she was saying. I've had quite a bit of meat in my mouth before while eating hotpot, and so this type of meat cooking method wasn't exactly anything new. However, usually when it comes to hotpot meat that is meant to be quickly dipped in and swirled around to be cooked, it is usually sliced very thin for obvious reasons. As you can somewhat see on the screen, the meat here was sliced pretty thin, but it wasn't ultra thin like the previous hotpot meats I've had, so that was my very first and early warning sign to not do what I did. I started eating this meat, and now, okay, I'm not a complete dumbass, alright? I dip it in the boiling water and I swirl it around a little bit right until the outside gets that grayish, opaque color. I'm not just shoving raw pieces of red meat into my mouth. However, I am so dead set on making sure that I don't overcook and ruin this meat that I probably leave it in the boiling water for about 5 seconds, which was, in hindsight, not enough time to fully cook the meat. And maybe I also did that because I like my steak medium rare. And so, how much of this undercooked meat did I eat? 1 piece? 2? Well, you see that platter in the picture? My mom tried a piece and our family friend also tried another one, which means I ate an entire tray of undercooked meat, since every single one I barely cooked for the sake of trying to keep it nice and tender. Also, now that I'm thinking back on this story, keep in mind that at this point the boiling water was red with the amount of spices in it. It's pretty normal. So there was like a 70-30 chance that the outside of the meat was also undercooked, but just because I assumed it was the spicy red broth giving it that red color, I ate it anyways. So we finished our food and we decided to take an MRT to the downtown area of the Danshui district just to walk around and sightsee and do all that touristy stuff. It is now 6 p.m. and roughly 2 hours have passed since I sat down to have the hotpot. We get to this bar/lounge, which is very nice by the way, and it overlooks the water, and we get some beers. As we are chilling and chatting, I start to feel a little strange. I don't want to say nauseous just yet. And keep in mind that this is day 1 of my vacation, and that same day I got off of a 16-hour flight, so I wasn't exactly alarmed that I felt a little bit strange. Well, as we are sitting there, maybe another 20, maybe even 30 minutes go by, and that nausea is now uncomfortable to the point where I just want to head back to the apartment and go to sleep. I don't know if the beer was a catalyst or just a coincidence of why I started feeling sick, but regardless, we decide to leave. I get back to the apartment, wash up, and immediately go to bed as the nausea is becoming a little bit unbearable by this point. But I figured, hey, I'll just sleep it off, and by the time I wake up tomorrow, hopefully all of that feeling is gone. Maybe an hour goes by and I wake up, and I'm now covered in cold sweat. If you watch my sushi gas station video, you know what I'm talking about. And it feels like I'm going to puke any minute, and I quickly fast walk to the bathroom, which thankfully was like right next to my bedroom, where I barely had time to make it before I threw up. Warning for anyone eating, and no, I'm not going to show you a picture of it, but this is a food poisoning video after all, so I will briefly describe what I violently threw up. It was literally balls of meat barely digested, but more so, I could see the raw undercooked portions now exposed in the toilet I threw up in. And this is why I was saying earlier that my food poisoning was most likely caused by undercooked meats alongside my gut bacteria and microbiome not being used to the local area. Usually when you throw up, you feel better afterwards. I did not. While I didn't have the immediate urge to throw up again, I still felt very sick and nauseous, and so I spent a few more minutes in the bathroom cleaning myself and my retainer, by the way, that I was wearing while I was throwing up. I finally leave the bathroom after about 10 minutes, and by this time my mother had now gone to sleep, but my family friend is still sitting right outside the bathroom watching TV, and she asks me if everything is okay. I have no idea if she heard me losing my mind in the bathroom, but I was too sick to really think that much about it. I tell her not to worry, everything's fine, before I stumble into my bedroom and go to sleep again. Maybe 2-3 hours go by. I don't actually know, because the next time I woke up, it was in the middle of the night. Everyone else had now gone to sleep, and I didn't even have time to look at my phone before running to the bathroom to throw up more balls of meat. This time it was so violent that I thought I would suffocate to death. Between throwing up and dry heaving, I would gasp for air while also trying not to choke on my own vomit. I was sweating so much that it looked like I was taking a shower. I had fluids coming out of both ends of my body for the next 5 hours or so until everyone else woke up. I was going in and out of the bathroom, and at one point I took a mini nap on the bathroom floor because I didn't want to risk throwing up in my bed. As you can imagine, during this entire time of expelling liquids on both ends of my body, I started to get really dehydrated, and so I chug a bottle of water. And then less than a minute goes by when I feel everything go from 50 to 100 as I projectile vomit that water and more into the toilet, which I thankfully was already standing next to. This is when things go from uncomfortable to genuinely terrifying. You see, I have had food poisoning before. Note my gas station sushi video. And while that experience was terrible in its own way, and the fact that it happened right before midterms, I never actually had an experience where I couldn't drink water. It was like I had rabies. The human body can go more or less 3 days without water. That is not a long time. The human body can go much less than that if that person is violently throwing up, feverishly sweating, and suffering from diarrhea every 10 minutes. To be honest, I was at first in denial. I thought to myself, no actual goddamn way that I, a human being, can't drink water. 20 minutes go by and I'm obviously still really thirsty. In fact, I'm even more thirsty than I was before, seeing how I just threw up twice the amount of fluids I drank. So I get myself some water again, and this time I took a teeny tiny small sip, which was actual torture, by the way, because I was so thirsty I just wanted to chug the entire bottle. A minute goes by. And then 2, and I'm thinking, all right, okay, maybe everything is okay. Until I again projectile vomit like 5 times the amount of fluids I drank back into the toilet. I am already delirious, but this escapade of drinking water and throwing up twice the amount has seriously weakened me to the point where I feel as if my entire body was jello, like I was living in a dreamlike state. I literally felt like Tantalus in the Greek myth, where he was punished for an eternity of being thirsty and hungry while standing in a pool of water that recedes when he goes in for a drink, and a fruit tree with branches that recede when he goes for a fruit. Here I was, thirsty to the point where I felt like I was about to die, surrounded by bottles of water and being unable to drink any of it. It is now 8 a.m. and I've been fighting for my life for hours and hours and hours now, and I have not held down any water since my first time throwing up. I actually feel like I'm close to dying. I know it sounds like I'm being dramatic, but that amount of fluid loss in that amount of time is seriously not a joke. On top of my fluid loss and nausea, I have a high fever. My mom around this time comes downstairs and sees me, and she kind of just freaks out, which, I mean, she is my mom, right? As in, like, she thinks I'm going to die. And shout out to my birth giver, by the way, for watching out for me. She stacks more blankets on top of me because I am shaking uncontrollably because my chills from my fever are are getting so bad, to the point where it looks like I'm in a chrysalis, or cocoon if you consider me more of a moth than a butterfly. But regardless, I feel like I am in a Stalingrad winter. We need to go to the emergency room, and thankfully the apartment we were at is coincidentally a 10-minute walk from a hospital. I am not going to mention the hospital's name for reasons that you'll find out later in this video. Our family friend from yesterday is now with us, and she is kind enough to go buy some bananas, bread, and other stuff that people who have food poisoning should be eating, while my mother slowly walks me to the hospital. We get there and my mouth is so dry that I can barely speak. I tell the receptionist what happened, a short summary of how many times I was throwing up, blah blah blah. And so when they measure my temperature, I have a 104-degree fever, or 40 degrees Celsius, and after talking to a doctor and telling him my story again, they took me to get some blood work done. I get to the lab area and they have a lot of trouble taking my blood as I'm so dehydrated, and the blood coming out of the syringes once they do find my vein looks more like tar than water. Oh, and by the way, they had to try multiple times to hit my vein, but I barely even felt it because I was so delirious. They also took my stool sample, which was also a nightmare experience because let's just say that things were coming out of my body, but they were more or less fluids. Finally, they lay me down on one of those hospital beds and they tell me that they would give me 2 IV bottles, anti-fever medication, and antibiotics. I am not a medical professional, so I apologize if my description of this is not very medical, but they first inserted some needles into my forearm, which actually did hurt a lot. I don't know how they stabbed it in, but anyways, they injected some in that same area. They injected some what I assumed were antibiotics. Then they inserted another needle into the back of my hand and started an IV before they rolled me into a big waiting room with a bunch of other patients. Now, this room was literally just an open area with some curtains to pull for privacy, although they told me not to pull it, so I don't know. But there was no actual buttons to push or anything if I needed a nurse, which will be relevant later. This was actually my first time ever getting an IV drip, and to give you an example of just how dehydrated I was, I remember my friends in the past telling me that one of the big things that happened to them after they got an IV was how much they had to pee afterwards. Well, I ended up getting 2 big ass IV bottles. I think they were like 1,000 milliliters. Don't quote me on that. I don't know the measurements, but they were big ass bottles, right? I got 2 of them pumped into me and I still didn't have to pee until almost a full day later. Anyways, I'm lying there and still with the IV being started, I still feel so incredibly thirsty. Imagine if you just ran like a marathon and you just had to drink water. That's how thirsty I was. And I tell my mom and my family friends accompanying her to just please go do whatever you have to do for the day, since it's not like they can make the IV drip faster even if they wanted to. And I just take this time to take a quick nap. I wake up around an hour later and the first IV bottle I was given is about halfway or so done. As I was saying before, I need 2 of these big IV bottles alongside 2 rounds of anti-fever medication. So as I'm waiting to see this IV drip finish, I really don't do much other than watching the bottle drip and drip. I mean, I have my phone on me, but the reception isn't that good, and I also don't have any like earbuds I can listen to music with. Finally, I see the first bottle is almost finished dripping and I eagerly wait for them to change it out as I am so still incredibly thirsty, and not to mention that I can't leave until they give me everything they're supposed to. 10 minutes go by. Nobody comes. Hey, I get it. Nurses are busy and I'm not the main character, so perfectly understandable that they're not going to be able to change out my IV right away. 20 minutes go by and I'm starting to get a little squirrely as I feel my chills starting to come back, because remember, I still had to get my second round of anti-fever medication by IV. 30 minutes go by and I already tried flagging down 1 or 2 nurses to ask if they would change my IV. They didn't respond, although I didn't take it personally because it looks like every nurse is assigned to a specific patient, so I understand that it wasn't their responsibility. The problem was that now my chills have come back in full force and I am shaking so uncontrollably that blood is traveling back up my IV because I can't help but tense up my hands and arms. My IV bottle wasn't attached to one of those movable stands, but to my hospital bed, so I couldn't like just walk to the reception or somewhere with a lot of nurses to flag down somebody unless I wanted to rip out all of my IVs. So maybe another 10 minutes go by and my mom shows up and she asks one of the people working at the hospital to see if they can check up on me and change my IV, and they tell her that having an empty IV won't kill me and to essentially fuck off, but they would still send someone over. Okay, maybe they didn't use those exact exact words, but they were pretty rude about it. My mom is extremely soft-spoken and kind, and so when she told me what happened, I was a little heated. My mom is obviously in distress, which I think would be a pretty fair reaction in this circumstance, and yes, I understand that having an empty IV won't kill me. I also kind of figured that out seeing how I didn't drop dead already. My mom was just asking to see if she could get some assistance because her son was shivering uncontrollably in the hospital bed with blood running up the IV. That's all. Anyways, the nurse that came to help me out was the opposite of the guy that my mom talked to. She was extremely sweet and actually brought me a heated blanket alongside helping me adjust so that the IV would flow more smoothly. And by the way, this entire time I was dangling kind of half off the bed because I'm like 5'11" and a little over 190 pounds, which means that at least in this hospital, I could barely move forward and backwards without flying off this hospital bed. And this nurse actually explains to me what happened, which is that there was a shift change and the previous staff just kind of forgot to mention that they needed somebody to watch over me, which I'm not mad about because I understand how hard medical personnel work and I understand that I am not the only patient. It was more so how they talked to my mother. My mom gives me some electrolyte sports drinks that she dilutes with water, and I sip on these tiny little cups to keep away my thirst. I am then told that once all of my drips are complete, they'll only discharge me from the hospital if I can drink plain water and keep it down without throwing up, as if I can't keep down the water, then I'm gonna end up right back in the hospital with more IVs being pumped into me. And I thought, well, fair enough. So I ask for some regular water and I take a mouthful and swallow, and a minute goes by before I feel myself getting nauseous, and my mom barely has time to grab a plastic bag before I projectile vomit all of that water out. Amazing. Fantastic. I guess I am not going anywhere anytime soon. A few more hours go by and I'm kinda losing my mind. I can still barely move in the hospital bed because my ass is so big that there isn't much room for me to shift around in, and so I decided to try drinking water again. This time I took a tiny sip that was almost comical, and then I'm told to wait another half an hour before they saw that I was fine and I didn't throw up, and then they finally discharged me from the hospital alongside giving me some more fever medication and antibiotics. If this is where the story had ended, I would be so grateful, but you see, the torture had just began. Of course, I was on a strict diet of bananas, plain bread, and other food of that sort. However, I was still unable to drink more than a tiny sip of plain water. The only liquids that I could drink had to have a bunch of electrolytes, think Gatorade. However, the place I was at didn't have any Gatorade or more fruit-tasting electrolyte drinks. The only drinks they had were these sports drinks that low-key tasted like drinking salt water. Now, they weren't awful to drink if you had them supplement the stuff you were drinking, but I could only drink that. And for the next week, I drank nothing but these saltwater tasting sports drinks. The rightmost one in this picture had the least saltwater taste, but all of them tasted salty. Imagine being the thirstiest you have ever been, and then someone hands you a glass of diluted salt water. That's sort of like what I was tasting, alright? I almost lost my mind. And remember, I was technically on vacation, so while I was recovering, I was unable to eat or drink much, and a lot of friends and family were taking us out to these amazing restaurants, but I couldn't have much other than plain rice and maybe some soup. And the most disappointing part is that when we traveled to Hunan to meet some friends and family, I was greeted with a bunch of spicy foods paired with Mao Tai, which is like Chinese liquor. And as I absolutely love Chinese cuisine, and specifically the spicier the better, Hunan, along with a few other provinces like Sichuan and Guizhou, also being known for their spicy food, I was extremely disappointed because my food poisoning meant that I had to miss out on all of it. Finally, as a part of this month-long trip, while I had a bunch of touristy stuff planned for my visit to Malaysia, instead, I was in Kuala Lumpur not doing much other than recovering from my food poisoning, whose effects lasted for 2 weeks, which is considered a very long time for food poisoning, as food poisoning usually resolves itself in a few days. The moral of the story, you should probably cook your meat if it's supposed to be cooked. Thank you for watching and making it to the end, and in case you missed the announcement, I plan on doing, at least for now, one gaming video a week, and then the following week I'll do a story time, history, or something like that. That way everyone is entertained, no matter which content you enjoy watching the most. A like and sub only if you want to, but of course, and as always, thanks for watching.